has a really interesting piece over at theweek.com. You'll recall back, I think it was Tuesday this week, I was talking about how middle-aged, middle-class white men are committing suicide and dying from alcoholism and drug addiction at a rate that is causing the death rate for the entire cohort of white men from roughly 35 to 60, or 35 to 54, as I recall, was the age range, is causing their death rate to go up in ways that we haven't seen since the collapse in any demographic like that, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. For a couple of years there after the collapse of the Soviet Union, similarly, you saw men dying like this for this reason. And it was, because of economic uncertainty. But Ryan, and the thing that I had missed in my analysis of this, I talked about racism. I talked about how, my dad had that white middle class dream, of when he came back from World War II, getting a job in a tool and die shop and getting a home in a suburb with the GI Bill and all these things that most African Americans were blocked from in the 50s. And my point was, we need to be sure, if we're going to put this economy back together, if we're going to change our trade policies, if we're going to bring our factories home, if we're going to put our cities back to work, that we do so in a way that's colorblind, that or to the extent it can be, that is all inclusive. Because by and large, the middle class boom in the 50s, I mean, we were a legally segregated society at that time. That boom was largely confined to white men about the age who are committing suicide now. And they're committing suicide because that future that they thought they had, that they grew up with, looking back on their parents, they don't have it. But Ryan Cooper says poor white Americans are dying of despair and racism is to blame. And, I thought this was fascinating. He says, well, basically that, poverty he says, American poverty is increasingly brutal. Male wages in the bottom fifth of the income ladder, for instance, have fallen by over 30% since the late 60s, and inequality has exploded. These days, those in the top 1% capture virtually all economic growth. I mean, if you've ever listened to Bernie Sanders, you know that to be the case. But then it gets really interesting. He says, now, the reason okay, you've got that, and you've got all these white, quote, middle-class men, middle-aged middle-class men who, in a previous generation, right now at this point in their lives, would have been making, in today's dollars, $30,000, $40,000 a year. In some cases, much more than that, $50,000, $60,000 a year in some cases, and so even $70,000 in some of the more specialized factory jobs. And now they're laid off. They don't have a job. And the social safety net in America is not strong enough to catch them. Right? Unemployment has been limited to a year in most places. The Republicans 2 years ago refused to extend long-term federal unemployment. It still has, it's still blocked. Welfare is only available for a maximum of 5 years. We are, 6 or 7 years into a Great Recession. And he points out that the reason why during the Clinton administration they cut back on welfare, during the Reagan administration, they cut back on housing and education assistance. During, just basically through this whole thing, is that, and why universities have become more expensive. They've done away with free education. Their disability insurance, unemployment insurance, all dialed back. No child allowance, no paid vacation, stuff like that. The reason all that stuff has gone away is because historically, the white people who are the majority of the voters voted against it because they believed, this is going back to Reagan's welfare queen thing, they believed that these welfare benefits were going to black people. And the white people were saying, we don't want to be paying taxes to be supporting a bunch of black freeloaders. And now the white people are in the position of needing those resources, and they're not there, which is something African Americans could have told you for a long, long time. Not to mention that the jobs aren't there, which, has been the case for African Americans for a long, long time. So I wanted to update my rant. I thought that was Just a fascinating insight and a really worthwhile one. To watch more clips from our programs, hit the
Of course I want safer streets, so I'm choosing a candidate with a plan to keep us safe.
Your vote.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Here's something that, welcome back to the program. Here's something I find very interesting. In the last hour, I shared with you the number one, that the secession of at least South Carolina from the Union was all about slavery. Now, number two, slavery is all about labor and the asset of the slaves. In other words, the wealth of the South, you could argue, was, lands and fields and farms and forests and things. But the real wealth of the South, going up toward the Civil War, was the slaves. This was the principal wealth, the principal, quote, property, end quote, that most of the slaveholders held, was the value of their slaves. And the value of their slaves was not just the value of something you can buy and sell in the open market, but it was also the value of the work that could be done by those slaves. This is a point that has not been lost on the corporations of America today. They don't typically refer to people as slaves any longer. And in fact, I would argue that they've even figured out slick new ways to game the system so that, we're having to pick up more and more of the costs of people's lives, the cost of housing, the cost of food, the cost of shelter, the cost of clothing, the cost of education, things that, healthcare, things that, with the exception of education, might have been picked up by a slaveholder in the past. So now corporations, the modern day plantation owners, as it were, they've even figured out a way where they don't even have the costs of holding slaves. They just get the benefit. And then we discovered that in 1936, Vance Muse starts this American Christian Association. Excuse me, the Christian American Association, and says this 1936. This is the official organization that is going to champion the right to work, in a workplace that does not have union representation. Why? Because the union representation protected people of color in the South. Now, the fact of the matter is, through the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and to some extent, I saw this through my own, my dad's eyes, I suppose. I spent a lot of time at Lansing Tool and Die when I was growing up. Metal Machining Company, excuse me, the company that Dad ultimately ended up with. He worked for Lansing Tool and Die and Lansing Die Sinking, and then he ended up with Metal Machining Company for 30, 40 years. In that the unions back then in some parts of the country, and I would say that this is, to some extent the case in Lansing, at least from what I saw, were arguably still agents of segregation. I don't recall any people of color ever working in my dad's tool and die shop, even though it was located in the part of Lansing that was surrounded by, a couple of square miles of people of color. So unions were used in the United States. We have to acknowledge this. Unions were used in the United States throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s to keep the workplace segregated in many places. But in the South, there were many places where unions were also used to elevate the political power status, the workplace power status of people of color as well. And so Vance Muse came along and said, we can't have this. And his sister talking about liberally using the N-word about her servant, her maid, this, that, and the other thing. And they started this, Christian American Association, and invented this right to work phrase. And now Scott Walker in Wisconsin after passing a voter ID law that makes it harder for people of color, urban dwellers, young people, and old people in the state of Wisconsin to vote, now is pushing through right to work for less legislation that, I mean, he already, as he told that billionaire woman a year or so ago that got caught on videotape where she said, what can we do to flip the state red? And he's like, I'm going to take the unions on and I'm going to play divide and conquer. I'm going to first go after the public sector unions because a lot of citizens can't figure out why somebody works for the state, has a pretty good job, needs a union. And then once we've taken down the public sector unions, then we'll go after the private sector unions, the for-profit sector unions, which is what they're doing right now. Even though during the last election, when he was running for re-election as governor, he said, no, I'm not going to go after those unions. He lied. Just like he said, no, I'm not going to go after abortion. He lied. Scott Walker is a liar. I mean, this is just part of his political history. And there's a lot of folks still sitting around scratching their heads going, why did he leave college? I've had this story told to me by several different people. Well, I don't want to repeat a story that I can't document. But I think the question, did Scott Walker get kicked out of college because of political shenanigans? He was running for student council or something like that. And was he kicked out of college because he got busted stealing newspapers that might have had an editorial that was unfavorable to him or something like that? The stories are out there. Whether they're true or not is something that has to be determined. But inquiring minds want to know. But anyhow, my point is that Right to Work for Less shares a racist history with secession and shares, frankly, in my opinion, a racist history with the largely white, middle class, and mostly boomer generation Tea Party. These are the people who were the white racists in the 50s and 60s and 70s, screaming at people of color who wanted to go to college or who wanted to go to school. This is the direction this country is going. And meanwhile, we have our corporations. I mean, it's like a free-for-all. You've got the corporations saying, no, we're going to take all that money and give it to our CEOs and stockholders. This is what I was talking about last week, this new Roosevelt Institute report on how corporations are taking most of their profits now. They used to reinvest their profits in equipment, in research and development, in marketing, in growing their business. They no longer do that. They now take their profits and use that money to buy back their stock, thus raising the value of their stock because they're stockholders. Now, prior to the Reagan administration, CEOs were not stockholders in companies. I mean, they could be, but they could not be compensated with stock. They could go out and buy the stock, but they didn't get it for working there. And Reagan changed those rules, and so now we've got an entire nation full of CEOs, many of whom, and arguably most of whom, don't give a damn about the company, don't care about the employees, don't care about the customers, don't care about the product, don't care about the community. The only thing they care about is jacking the stock price up. And so now, the S&P went through 5,000 yesterday. The Dow is over whatever it is. And people say, oh, look at the economy is doing great. The stock market's up. No, the stock market's up because the businesses that are represented on the stock exchange, on the New York Stock Exchange and all the various other ones. Ryan Cooper has a really interesting piece over at theweek.com. You'll recall back, I think it was Tuesday this week, I was talking about how middle-aged, middle-class white men are committing suicide and dying from alcoholism and drug addiction at a rate that is causing the death rate for the entire cohort of white men from roughly 35 to 60, or 35 to 54, as I recall, was the age range. is causing their death rate to go up in ways that we haven't seen since the collapse in any demographic like that since the collapse of the Soviet Union. For a couple of years there after the collapse of the Soviet Union, similarly, you saw men dying like this for this reason. And it was, because of economic uncertainty. But Ryan, and the thing that I had missed in my analysis of this, I talked about racism. I talked about how, my dad had that white middle class dream, of when he came back from World War II, getting a job in a tool and die shop and getting a home in a suburb with the GI Bill and all these things that most African Americans were blocked from in the 50s. And my point was, we need to be sure if we're going to put this economy back together, if we're going to change our trade policies, if we're going to bring our factories home, if we're going to put our cities back to work, that we do so in a way that's colorblind, or to the extent it can be, that is all inclusive. Because by and large, the middle class boom in the 50s, I mean, we were a legally segregated society at that time. That boom was largely confined to white men about the age who are committing suicide now. And they're committing suicide because that future that they thought they had, that they grew up with, looking back on their parents, they don't have it. Ryan Cooper says poor white Americans are dying of despair and racism is to blame. And, I thought this was fascinating. He says, well, basically that, poverty isn't, he says, American poverty is increasingly brutal. Male wages in the bottom fifth of the income ladder, for instance, have fallen by over 30% since the late 60s, and inequality has exploded. These days, those in the top 1% capture virtually all economic growth. I mean, if you've ever listened to Bernie Sanders, you know that to be the case. But then it gets really interesting. He says, now, the reason that, okay, you've got that, and you've got all these white, quote, middle-class men, middle-aged middle-class men who, in a previous generation, right now at this point in their lives, would have been making, in today's dollars, $30,000-$40,000 a year. In some cases, much more than that, $50,000-$60,000 a year. In some cases, and so even $70,000 in some of the more specialized factory jobs. And now they're laid off. They don't have a job, and the social safety net in America is not strong enough to catch them. Right? Unemployment has been limited to a year in most places. The Republicans 2 years ago refused to extend long-term federal unemployment. It still has, it's still blocked. Welfare is only available for a maximum of 5 years. We are 6 or 7 years into a Great Recession. And he points out that the reason why during the Clinton administration they cut back on welfare. During the Reagan administration, they cut back on housing and education assistance. During just basically through this whole thing is that and why universities have become more expensive. They've done away with free education. Their disability insurance, unemployment insurance, all dialed back. No child allowance, no paid vacation, stuff like that. The reason all that stuff has gone away is because historically, the white people who are the majority of the voters voted against it because they believed, this is going back to Reagan's welfare queen thing, they believed that these welfare benefits were going to black people. And the white people were saying, we don't want to be paying taxes to be supporting a bunch of black freeloaders. And now the white people are in the position of needing those resources, and they're not there, which is something African Americans could have told you for a long, long time. Not to mention that the jobs aren't there, which, has been the case for African Americans for a long, long time. So I wanted to update my rant. I thought that was just a fascinating insight. Best of the rest of the news, the American dream is starting to look more and more like, a dream. According to an expansive Associated Press study published over the weekend, 4 out of 5 U.S. adults
struggle with joblessness, near poverty, or reliance on welfare for at least part of their lives. The study also found that risks of poverty have been increasing in recent decades and warned that by 2030, based on the current trend of widening income inequality, close to 85% of all working age adults in the United States will experience bouts of economic insecurity. 46.2 million Americans, 15% of the population, now live in poverty, an all-time high. As our economy continues to shed manufacturing jobs and low-paying jobs take their place, that number will continue to rise, especially for the rural and working-class white Americans who make up the bulk of our country's poor. It's been over 30 years since Ronald Reagan came to Washington and ushered in an era of trickle-down economics. By now, it should be clear to everyone that the free market extremism supported by the Republican Party is a complete and utter failure. The wealth that was supposed to trickle down to the middle class has instead been handed to the richest 1% of our population. You'd think Republicans would want to apologize for turning America into a third world country, but maybe not. I'm joined now by Carlos Curbelo, GOP strategist and Republican candidate for Congress for Florida's 26th district. Carlos, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
The L in your middle initial.
No problem.
So are you and the rest of the Republican Party ready to apologize to America for 32 years of Reaganomics?
Well, Tom, this is incredible. For years, we've heard the left blame George W. Bush for all of America's problems. But
it's war problem.
Now we're going back to the Reagan years. And I wasn't around, but I've heard that the last few years of the Carter administration were very difficult ones for this country. Interest rates through the roof, the world in turmoil. And Ronald Reagan came under very difficult circumstances, worked with Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, to bring tax cuts to the American people.
Tip O'Neill was not enthusiastic about the tax cuts.
But
to say Reagan worked with Tip O'Neill, you know, it was the same. I was around during that time, and it was the same sort of thing that historically American politics has been. What we have right now is an anomaly. Really, it's been, other than
we have
the entire 20th century,
lack of leadership in the White House, because we've seen many presidents work with Congresses of different parties over the years. This president has failed. Ronald Reagan didn't. He got Tip O'Neill to go along, and the Democrats passed tax cuts.
Ronald Reagan did not have a group of Democrats who, on the night that he was inaugurated, got together in the Caucus Room restaurant and swore basically a blood oath to each other to destroy anything that he wanted to do to repair the economy. Not at all.
Well, we don't know that.
What we do, look at the number of filibusters during the 8 years of Reagan's presidency. How many were there? There was either one or two. How many do we have now? Over 400. This is the Republicans are doing obstructionism now.
And during the Bush years,
in a way that is insane.
And during the Bush years, the Democrats blocked many of President Bush's
close
nominees.
to what's going on. Nothing close to what's going on.
The first Hispanic that was going to serve on the D.C. appellate court was
this
shot
is an
down
organized campaign to destroy the American economy so that they can blame it on Barack Obama and the Democrats.
I mean,
they brag about it.
I don't agree with you. Look at what's happening now with health care, with President Obama's Obamacare, the affordable or the unaffordable.
Yeah, suddenly the price of health insurance has dropped in half.
The president himself has recognized that it's a failure. I can tell you, I'm a school board. Of course, that's why he postponed the employer mandate.
No, he's reacting. The Republicans are refusing to implement pieces of this in various states. So he's saying, okay, we'll take another year.
I'll give you a concrete example. Miami-Dade County Public Schools, where I serve as a board member. Next year, our chief financial officer already told us that he expects $4 million in additional administrative costs because of the health care law.
Yeah, and you'll save more than that.
Guess where those $4 million? No, that's just an administrative cost.
Costs are going
in
down.
Other estimated increases, $14 million. So we're talking about $18 million. Guess who's going to miss out on that money? Teachers and the rest of our employees.
No, insurance prices are going down. But beyond that, are you still trying to sell us?
Not in
okay,
Florida.
What's your alternative?
To introduce the consumer into the healthcare equation, right? Which is exactly what the president's trying to avoid.
Go back to what we have.
Health savings accounts. You know what? People take control over their health care.
Save some of your paychecks so when you're sick, you can pay your doctor's bills. What a brilliant idea. What do you do when you get cancer and it's $1 million hospital bill?
Well, that's why you have high deductible plans, right?
So we should all have basically
HSAs
the
with
Walmart
high deductible plans.
We should all have Walmart plans plus plus
No,
take a third of our
we should
paychecks,
have a
et cetera, et
blend.
cetera.
Health savings accounts plus high deductible
Back
plans.
to my
That's
original
what
point. Are
insurance
you
is
guys
supposed to be.
still defending Reaganomics? We're still operating in the Reaganomics world. It was a genuine Reagan revolution.
I defend the free enterprise system. I absolutely do. And time after time, we see that when government intervenes, the housing bubble, guess who created the housing bubble, which has made so many people poor because they lost their homes?
Phil Gramm.
Phil Gramm. And during the Clinton years, everyone was told that everyone should try to own a home. And the government did everything possible to help people own homes.
Fantasy.
And look what happened. Look what happened.
Name a specific piece of legislation. And one thing that the Democrats did,
you're telling me that President Clinton actually has acknowledged
the housing crisis,
that his government had a role in producing
Phil
the housing
Gramm's piece
crisis.
of legislation was passed in the last year of the Clinton
And
administration.
who signed it?
Bill Clinton, but he was not.
He got to own up to that.
What it did.
And by the way,
Graham Leach Bliley.
And by the way, Republicans are guilty too. I'm not saying Democrats are the only ones that intervene in the economy. Republicans can too. And that's created a ton of poverty.
Okay, to set aside debate for a moment, just to clarify, you still hold to the idea that wealth is not created from the bottom up or the middle out, as President Obama says, but rather from rich people spilling stuff off the edges of their tables.
No, I don't think so.
That's what Reagan said.
No, I think we got to allow the middle class to grow. And how does the middle class grow? When people create jobs, when people start businesses.
So who's creating the jobs? The rich people? So the middle class will grow when the rich people decide to spend money.
No, the middle class.
But the rich people keep putting their money overseas.
And sometimes low-income people can create jobs too.
We have corporate hoarding at levels that we've never seen in the history of the United States.
You know why? Because the corporate sector
they can.
Because they're scared. Because there's so much uncertainty in the economy.
They are not scared at all.
Because
we have
$17 trillion in debt, and no one knows what's going to happen if that keeps growing.
They've never had before. The stock market's higher than it's ever been before. The rich are getting richer, incredibly richer. The middle class, 32 years of Reaganomics is hollowed out.
We have to establish an environment in this country where companies want to invest. Where
then let's go back to that period from
1940
to 1980, when we had 4 consecutive decades of 3+% growth. First time it had ever happened in the history of America. The strongest time in the history of America before Reaganomics, when we had a top tax rate of 91% and 74% respectively, when corporations were paying 34% of the total tax load in this country instead of the 11% they are now.
Isn't that the type of system that Europe has had for many years now? And look where it's gotten them. Spain, it's 25% unemployment.
Spain's problem has nothing to do with Reaganomics. Spain's problem has to do with buying into the euro and not having control over their own currency. We control our own currency.
And it has nothing to do with their pension system, with their welfare state, with their tax system.
No, it all has to do with the EU. That's a false analogy.
Agree with
if you want to pick a European example of where it works, try Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, any of the countries that still control their own currency.
What about?
They're doing just fine, thank you very much.
So you blame all of Europe's woes on the euro.
Actually, most of Europe is
not on their unsustainable social welfare programs.
Absolutely.
Well,
absolutely.
That's a disagreement that we'll have every day.
Yeah, okay. Carlos, nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Westminster, Maryland. We're about 45 minutes northwest of Baltimore, and we're here in front of the Carroll County Department of Social Services. Last time we were here, we spoke to many residents who said the increasing demand on social services seems to be on a lot of people's radars. So we came back and we asked folks here in this predominantly white working class town, what comes to mind when they think of public assistance?
I do hear things how people just say, hey, just say this or say that so they can get more out of the system. And that's hurting everybody else who does need the help.
That's what I'm talking about by abusing it. People selling their food stamps or, trading it to drug dealers for drugs. Here's $200 of food stamps. Give me what you'll give me. I mean, there's a lot of that going on.
And do you feel like people are taking advantage of public assistance?
Or
is that not?
Yeah, I saw somebody with a BMW to walk in and have the bills paid.
Fraud, abuse, dependency. That's how many in this town of about 18,000 residents would label public assistance. Almost 90% of residents here are white, and the majority vote conservative. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, 17% of the population of Westminster lives below the federal poverty line. If you compare that to the state average of 9%, it's considerably higher. That means about 3,060 residents could qualify for programs like food stamps and temporary cash assistance, otherwise known as TCA, Maryland's version of welfare. But in reality, about 220 households in 2012 received TCA in the entire Carroll County of 170,000 residents. So who are the people behind these programs? And is it riddled with the level of fraud that many in Westminster point to? We spoke with waitress Carrie Beecham, who was on public assistance after her divorce.
I had the opportunity actually when my marriage came to an end and my husband kind of kicked me out of the house to try to actually take advantage of the food stamp service. And I actually had some help with my electric bill as well, because I wanted to be a responsible adult and pay my bills and take care of my family.
Carrie's case is more the norm rather than the anomaly. Based off of the state's 2012 statistics, 90% of those receiving cash assistance were women, all of them with dependent children, and 40% of them had children under the age of 3. But only 12% of all cases were required to participate in work-related activities. According to Maryland law, you may be excused from the work requirement if you are a parent with a child under the age of 6 and childcare is not available.
I think it is primarily women, sure, the single moms and stuff that have kind of been abandoned or left on their own, or that are trying to make sure that they're taking care of their children and provide for them.
Trying to provide for their family is what Executive Director of Human Services Programs of Carroll County, Cindy Parr, says she witnesses on a daily basis. Lazy is one word she says she would certainly not use to describe them.
I don't see the majority of our clients as being lazy. I see the majority of our clients as being people who are working very hard, trying to make a living wage.
And for Parr, the profile of a typical recipient of public assistance looks very different from the stereotype.
It's probably a family in their 30s to late 30s with children, and relatives may be living with them that are also having a tough time, an elderly relative that may be living with them. I think that might be my take.
So after being in the field, we decided to head back into the Baltimore newsroom to get an expert's opinion on why there's so much stigma attached to welfare. So we turned to historian and Oregon State University Associate Professor Marisa Chappell. Marisa, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So Marisa, how did we even get here? Why is there so much stigma attached to welfare in the United States?
The program that we think of as welfare today is Aid to Families with Dependent Children. That's what it was called. And it developed in the 1930s as part of a broader package of social welfare benefits. The designers of these programs really believed that the ideal family had a male breadwinner and a female homemaker. And so they set up old age insurance and unemployment insurance to protect male breadwinner jobs. And for women who lacked a male breadwinner and were raising children, they added federal funds to state-level mothers' pensions programs. So this was a small cash benefit to poor children who lived in single mother households.
But the welfare system that we know of today goes back to 1996. That's when former President Bill Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. And how did it change exactly? First off, it required participants to spend 40 hours a week in work-related activities. Second, it enforced time limits. Participants could not be on welfare for more than 2 years consecutively and 5 years over a lifetime. And third, Chappell said it changed the funding model.
People who qualified would get that money and the states would get a matching grant from the federal government. What happened in 96 is that funding model changed, and now it's a block grant, a capped block grant to states. So the states get a certain amount of federal money, not related to what the need is in the state. And so now the entitlement essentially is over. So it became much more difficult to get on the rolls in the first place. If you went into a welfare office to apply, there are all sorts of requirements before that. You have to go call a certain number of employers. You have to ask family members for help, these sorts of things. So these are diversionary tactics. Welfare offices would kick people off of the welfare rolls for very small infractions if they filled out paperwork incorrectly, if they were late to an appointment and this sort of thing. And that became an opportunity to reduce the rolls that way as well.
Proponents of reform, like President Clinton in this New York Times op-ed, How We Ended Welfare Together, point to how welfare rolls dropped from 12.3 million in 1996 to 4.6 million 10 years later. But what experts say got people off welfare in the first place was the booming economy of the 90s, when employment was at a record high. Today, employment numbers are at a 30-year low. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 58% of the civilian population over the age of 16 had a job in 2013. Yet the number of folks on welfare rolls remained the same, despite the poor economy.
Even during recessions, the welfare rolls did not increase significantly. And that means that fewer people who need it are getting benefits. And people who leave the welfare rolls for employment, and a majority do leave for employment, are going into the same jobs they had before. They're to low-wage service jobs that lack the flexibility and the pay and the benefits that enable them to raise a family out of poverty.
When it comes to lifting families out of poverty, the U.S. ranks low compared to other rich nations. A report released last year by UNICEF found that more than 1 in 5 American children fall below a relative poverty line, meaning they live in a household that earns less than half of the national median income. Out of all the 35 developed countries surveyed, the United States ranked 34th, above only Romania. Here in Westminster, residents point to how the system doesn't help people get out of poverty. Rather, folks like Brian Cosette say it creates dependency. He says his girlfriend, who has a 7-year-old daughter, gets $360 a month in assistance, but he thinks she could be working instead of collecting welfare.
Julia absolutely could go and work, and yeah, I mean, actually, as a matter of fact, she just put an application in yesterday at one of the restaurants locally. She wants to start working again. She's been working for her whole life, basically. And yes, there are people that are just are lazy, and if they can fill the right forms out, and their, parents have been doing it, and their uncle does it, and everybody does it, it just becomes, this is what you have to do to get your free money, and everybody depends on that money, instead of, going out and working for everything they have. They'd, rather just sit around, chill, and get a check in the mail.
But Professor Chappell says this idea of dependency can actually create independence.
We talk a lot about dependence. Welfare creates dependence. And for many single mothers, welfare aid from the state actually allowed them to have more independence. It allowed them to perhaps reject the most exploitative employment, to prioritize their children during times when they needed to do so, to leave abusive relationships, or to be less dependent upon the economic support of male partners.
The economics of public assistance is being debated in Washington, but not on the issue of whether or not to cut spending, but rather by how much. This year, Congress passed a bill that cut $8.7 billion from food stamps. About 850,000 households nationwide have lost on average about $90 a month of benefits. But new research by the Economic Policy Institute found that if you raise the minimum wage to $10.10, more than 1.7 million American workers would no longer rely on public assistance, and it would save taxpayers $7.6 billion a year. With Maryland's current minimum wage at $7.25, the state's Governor O'Malley signed into law a bill that will raise the minimum wage to $10.10 by 2018. According to EPI, a single parent with 2 children in the Westminster region would have to earn almost $63,000 to keep a secure and modest living standard. For working mothers like Carrie in a town with a median income of $48,000, a wage increase couldn't come soon enough. For the Real News Network, Jessica Devereaux, Westminster, Maryland.
How Google Duo helps you call your friends on Android. Wait, that's it?
America's oldest homeless shelter is now catering to more New Yorkers than ever. And it's not just the poor that line up for a hot meal. It's the average working American who can't make ends meet.
During this really cold snap especially, we don't, typically the guests that stay overnight, they get a meal and they stay overnight. The ones that don't go out because we don't have enough beds for everybody. We do a lottery, but when it's cold like this, this will cafeteria will be transformed with mattresses on the floor. Every hallway, every space that we can put a chair, we won't let anybody go outside tonight because you die in this kind of weather.
On this edition of Inside Out, we will discover how life has changed for many Americans since the Great Recession, and we'll take you on an exclusive tour inside one of the busy shelters of New York City. Now, the U.S. economy has shown some signs of recovery after the Great Recession, and official unemployment rates have dipped. But the economic outlook for many working families remains to look bleak. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly 1/3 of working families don't earn enough to make ends meet. Most American workers are able to find jobs, but those jobs are often low paying.
There has to be job growth in America. I see people standing out in line in the cold waiting to get jobs. They want to have jobs, but they have to get better job opportunities and higher wages also. The minimum wage has to be raised a little bit, enough where people can sustain a decent living and kind of nurture people back towards the middle class.
David Sweeney is an economist based in New York. He's lived in the city for the past 20 years.
Right across the street from his office, David tells me that people are lined up almost on a daily basis in hope of being hired for one of the many minimum wage jobs.
So, Susan, those people I just showed you in line, most likely that's a minimum wage job. And there's another possibility that that's not enough for them to survive on, and they have to go to these soup kitchens or food places where they give out food to the people, and it just doesn't seem right. And then there's a push to cut those back. They cut the food stamps back, the U.S. government did, and now people are getting less of those. So it really makes it tough for people. Now, Bloomberg was a mayor for 12 years, and all he was about was business, rezoning. This is the worst it's been.
A quick look at recent statistics show over 146 million Americans are either poor or low income. 57% of all American children live in a home that is either poor or low income. 32% of all working families are considered to be among the, quote, working poor. But that's part of the story. Many can't find jobs and need help as they jump through the bureaucratic hurdles of public assistance and often end up in the streets or relying on shelters for a bed to sleep and a warm meal.
There should not be people sleeping on the streets, in train stations. There are not enough housing, affordable housing. You see that in New York, where people are just being priced out of the market. Where are they going to go? How are they going to feed their families? You have women who are single parents, and they're having trouble feeding their kids. It's heartbreaking.
Earlier, I headed to the New York City Rescue Mission. They not only cater to those that are homeless, but the growing number of the working poor here in New York City. Established in 1872, it's the oldest shelter of its kind across the United States.
My name is Craig Mays. I'm the director of this mission, which happens to be, we're kind of proud of this. It's the oldest mission, 1872. So for 142 years, we've been caring for the poor and homeless in New York City. And just so you know, we're in a construction. We're actually doubling our space and doubling our capacity. So you're going to see a building in progress right now. For the first time in our history, we're going to have overnight emergency shelter for women, but we're also doubling our capacity for emergency shelter for men, and also doubling our men that are in a year-long program, recovery program. So lots of work going on here to offer help to even more. So we have currently have 30 beds for men that are in a residential recovery program. So this is their home. They live here for a year. They address issues that underlie their homelessness or poverty. So it's addictions, it's work issues, it's education. So this is their dorm now, but after the renovation, this will be the dorm for our women who will be an emergency shelter. So 30 women will live here every night, come out of the cold or out of the heat, and have food, shower, clothing, a nice bed to sleep in, and hopefully stabilize their life a little bit.
The men will then go upstairs to the 6th floor, and the beds will be double in size, another clear indication for the increasing demand of these forms of assistance.
1 out of 3 New Yorkers is in a situation where they're not adequately able to feed themselves. And so that makes the population, that's in the millions of people. And you know, when you're in Manhattan, you see all the wealth and you see all the building, you don't really see it. It's but it's hidden. Even in Manhattan, there are pockets here of real poverty. And then you get out in the other boroughs like the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn and Queens, there's a lot of poverty. So it's a big problem. Last year, the Department of Homeless Services for New York City was putting the census for homeless population in like 50,000 or so. But that's just people that come into the shelter system so they can actually keep track of them. But they're putting that number in just 12 months now up around 63,000. Wow. So are they counting better? Is there an increase? I think it's both. Definitely there's an increase. And we're seeing here at the Mission an increase in demand for what we offer to people.
Even from last year.
Even from last year.
As we head down to the kitchen, Mays tells me more about the people they serve.
We've also seen an increase in the population of the working poor. We serve the homeless here, but we also serve the working poor. Let me go this way. And this zip code where the Mission exists is actually listed recently as the 7th most expensive place to live in the country. Yet at the same time, we have a population within the zip code that is extremely poor. So we do a food pantry 3 times a week where they can come and they can get a bag of staple food. They typically have jobs, but when it comes down to whether they're going to pay rent or they're going to put food on the table, they got to pay rent. So they're not able to put adequate food on the table. So they come here and we provide a pasta and beans, and if we get fresh produce that we can give away, we do that as well. So we definitely see that demand growing where we're giving more of that away. The lines are getting longer. The people that sign up for it, the numbers are increasing. But we might be able to seat 60 or 70 at a time. But for every dinner meal, we'll serve between 250 and 300. So they come in, and as they leave, we bring more in.
Pedro is the chef at the Mission, and he's been here for 7 years. You may remember him on the hit TV show Chopped, the cooking show competition on Food Network. Pedro was a contestant on the episode Hero Chefs, chefs that are considered heroes in their communities.
I'm the head chef at the New York City Rescue Mission, serving at least 500 homeless people a day.
Ready to go.
And we cook all kinds of food, Italian, Spanish food, French. Not only am I the chef at the New York City Rescue Mission, but at my local church, I'm the mercy minister.
Let's bow our heads and let's pray.
8 years ago, I was going down a wrong road. I was homeless, I was an addict, and this church helped me recover. I was able to go to culinary school, and food changed my life. I'm going on Chopped to win for the homeless, the forgotten. I'm going up there for them.
Today's menu is Spanish rice, stuffed plantains, roast chicken, and butternut squash soup. Every day, they get a protein, starch, and vegetable. And then Pedro gets creative with the menu. We arrived right in time for lunch.
So I've served a lot of people. I don't have the exact number, but now whatever number that was, it's doubled. And it's going to double as we continue to, obviously you see the construction and you see what's going on. So yeah, it's going to double and we're going to increase. I think that there's more working poor in New York. I think the face of the homeless has changed. It's not only the person that doesn't have a job, it's the person that has a job and living check to check. I just read an article today that in the airport, there's 2 types of security wages. We can continue to serve him. There's the $8 and the $17. There's the guy, and it said it just like this. The guy is making $8 an hour, and he's working security, doing the same job as the other person, but he has to eat at soup kitchens. So the soup kitchen is providing a service for those who are working as well. It's no longer, the way it was in 1872 or 1911 or 1920. Excuse me, I'm just going to grab these plantains. Yeah, pretty good, right? Vehicle of meat. Here you go, sir.
Working with Pedro is El Salvador, along with Mike, who is helping out and is part of the recovery program.
I am from the Gulf Coast of Alabama. I'm from a little town, born in a little town called Cushla, Alabama. And if anybody's from Cushla is watching this, roll Tide, go Wolfpack. No, I lost my job because I was drinking too much.
After losing his job, Mike started hitchhiking, hoping to make it to Boston.
I was hitchhiking, trying to avoid New York. Started my travels back around July-ish, somewhere around there, and thought I would bust my way up to Boston, go to B-Town, and maybe work somewhere around the New England coast, trying to work on the water. I've done a lot of my work on the water down in the Gulf Coast between Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. and I got a ride in what was the name of the town? Allentown or something like that, I think is where I was. And I got like I said, I hitchhiked the whole way up. And got a ride all the way up there from Allentown, and this guy's like, look, I got to go over to George Washington Bridge. Just let me know where you want me to let you out. So I was like, all right. Well, there was no place for him to let me out. So I ended up in New York. Didn't know where I was. The first time I've been in New York, I come over, it was 178th Street is where I was. Right on at the GW Bridge, right. And I didn't know what to do or where to go, so I just started walking. And I walked from 178th Street to here.
After a brief relapse, Mike returned here and says there's nowhere else he'd rather be.
Tell you what, though, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else right now than where I'm at. Really? Yeah, really. For one, I'm sober. Yeah. And for two, you know, I'm doing something good in my life that doesn't require me of breaking the law or being regretful for it. Yeah, you know, because I've always heard the saying. They got the sayings, "You're right where you're supposed to be." You know, you're here for a reason. And I hated that saying. Hated it with a passion because I didn't want to hear that. Because I didn't want to think I was supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be out making money and doing what I want to do. But I'm doing exactly where God wants me at. You know? I mean, you know, you say God to a lot of people in the world, and they're like, oh, God, you know, what's this God? Da, 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 da. Were you like that before? Never. No, never. I've always believed in God. I just always ran from him. That's how I ended up in New York.
The New York City Rescue Mission is supported by caring individuals, churches, foundations, and businesses. Less than 2% of the mission's revenue comes from government funds.
Actually, of our budget, there's about 1 or 2% that somehow has a government connection to it, which might be some food grants that we get. But we're an independent organization, not relying on the government, which is good because taxes and, well, just like the SNAP issue, right? Yeah. The supplemental. They $5 billion cut out of the budget. So now families that were receiving that are receiving about $29 less per week to buy food. And so where are they going to look for help? They're going to come here. And if we're getting it from the government, guess what? We got cut as well. So we don't mind the government. We're not anti-government, but we're just trying to be a privately run organization that counts on the goodness of New Yorkers to fund us.
There is also a learning center.
I actually think when we expand and have 250 people living here every night, we're going to be able to add a staff person whose whole job will be job placement in aftercare. Part of it is going to be networking with businesses and organizations. So in advance, we say, hey, can you give us 2 or 3 positions a year, and we'll get guys ready for it, and then you can give them a chance. Yeah. Because you can't, if you go through a program like this and you can't get work, you can't get a home, you can't buy food. So
is there a limit on how long someone can stay here?
Well, right now it's 9 months to a year. So pretty much 9 months is the program, dealing with issues of recovery, addiction, whatever it is. And then the last 3 months are transition. So it's doing job interviews. If they get a job, it's helping them to save money up, trying to find affordable housing, helping them get into that affordable housing. So
ultimately, their goal is to turn no one away.
So we might say 50% of the men that come here have alcohol or addiction problems. The other 50%, it's family issues, it's child support issues, it's loss of employment. So we address those as well. So we kind of put everybody on an individual track. We assess where they're at, what their needs are, and develop a program to help them.
New York's new mayor, Bill de Blasio, has proposed his first budget plan, which aims to help the homeless and low-income New Yorkers and reverses many of the misguided and harmful cutbacks proposed by the previous administration.
Ours is a progressive administration. Our budget will be a progressive budget, one that puts us on the road to giving hardworking New Yorkers a fair shot. And I want to make something absolutely clear, because I think the discourse in this town and probably all over the country in recent years has missed this point. There is nothing mutually exclusive between being both fiscally responsible and economically progressive, something we have to do in tandem. It may sound counterintuitive to some, but we need a balanced budget and a strong and stable city government to facilitate our fight against inequality. We have to do both at the same time. The reason is being fiscally responsible is what allows us to be a healthy, functioning government that is better positioned to serve people's needs and build a pathway to greater equality.
In addition to these highlights, the de Blasio fiscal year 2015 budget plan, of course, includes other more highly publicized proposals that will enormously help homeless and poor New Yorkers.
Forward. And then our people have faced another challenge because of the federal cuts to food stamps, to the SNAP program. Food stamp totals will be reduced. The food stamp allotment will be reduced for literally 1 million New York City households in need. Let me do that again. Food stamp benefits will be reduced because of the farm bill that was passed last week. 1 million New York City households will get less support, regardless of the dire circumstances they find themselves in.
I think that you're going to have poor. You're always going to have poor. Are we doing a better job? Are the numbers increasing or decreasing? And I don't think the numbers lie. I think the problem is becoming greater. There was just an election for a new mayor in this city, and one of the platforms of what they talked about a lot in the discussion was the inequality or the gap that seems to be getting bigger. So the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And the mayor is talking about policies that are going to try to change that. But I think it's a big problem to solve. It's integrated into the whole economic system, the whole taxation system, and in the meantime, shelters like ours, we're left with the problem of actually trying to put more food on the table and creating more space for people while we figure this out.
We wrapped up our tour at the shelter on the 6th floor, under construction now, but with a vision of bringing hope and security to the increasing number of New Yorkers who need it.
So this is going to be one of our dormitories that will house 80 transient men. So there'll be 40 bunk beds in here. Scattered throughout the room, there'll be some lockers to put stuff in overnight. And then over here will be showers and restrooms. And in through this door is laundry. We have to clean all the sheets every night, all the towels, and start over the next day. So it's pretty Spartan, but it's safe, it's warm, it's dry. And they'll come up here after they've had a meal. They'll come up and get a shower, and they'll get a good night's sleep. And then we'll feed them breakfast in the morning before we send them out for the day.
With millions of
This Georgia is heavy as I was.
How loud are you?
About 280.
18+% of our children right now are obese.
If you go with the flow in America today, you will end up overweight or obese, as 2/3 of Americans do.
I don't want to be fat for the rest of my life. I've got diabetes.
The man in black destroyed everything in my world.
This is where I usually stop on a pretty much daily basis to get gas or get something to eat. And what I call my Superman juice, Red Bull. That helps me out on a daily basis also. I know it's not good for you, but it helps. Getting up so early doesn't give me the time to stay home and actually get a nice home cooked meal. So thanks to Wawa, I get it on the go. Stop here for about 5-10 minutes, get something to eat in me, and then just take off and get on the road again.
We have the latest statistics from the U.S. Census Bureau to give us a very specific measurement of how poor the city of Reading is compared to the rest of the country. And we have the unfortunate distinction of being named the poorest city in the country of any city of 65,000 population or greater.
the biggest thing has been the loss of jobs. I think the number one most devastating one was when when Lucent Industries closed their office here in Reading. There were over 700 people who were laid off and lost their jobs.
I think today for the residents in the city of Reading, it's a daily struggle to get by, to pay for basic needs, to get access to health care that you need, to put food on your table, and to care for your children.
I don't know what the answer is, but I mean, I think the dilemma is how in the world are we going to get jobs back for people? And it has to happen soon because people don't have hope. And if you grow up without hope, then you just are going to give up. And then another generation will come along, and then it gets harder and harder, and it becomes more entrenched.
My name's Glenn Kegereis, and I'm 46 years old, and I live in Reading, Pennsylvania. I live here with my daughter, Kelsey. She's 16. I lived here basically my whole life. I went away in the Marines for 4 years, and I came right back. I went to Remcon Plastics, and I started out as a machine operator and worked my way up there and was a supervisor for 13 or 14 years. The pay wasn't great, but it was consistent, and my wife was working at the same time. So between the two of us, we made a decent living.
Then before you know it, he lost his job, and my sister had worked at Lucent's and she lost her job. So they all lost their jobs. And, you know, for a while they were all maintaining with unemployment and stuff like that. But I mean, they were probably even on that almost 2 years. Little by little, you know, the expenses don't change, your income changes, but the bills don't change.
Yeah, I got stuff upstairs to pack. I mean, if you want to go up. When my wife and I split, moved in with my brother. But now my brother's ill, and he's in Florida because he's living with his son. Regular bills are paid, but the mortgage never got touched because there wasn't that kind of money to do it. So I'm basically freeloading in the house until it's taken away. The house is already in the process of foreclosure. I yell at my kids if they don't come down with a box. Everything's being piled into one room so that we can get it close to the front door and test to get out in case I don't have a lot of help when I have to go. So I keep bringing it in. So getting it all together, getting it out of here so as we can move whatever we got to wherever we're going. Don't know that yet. Without my family, I'd be out in the street now. I know that.
Everybody worked all of their lives, and it was difficult to see things falling apart as they did. You try to help each other out, but you don't always have the means to do it.
When we look at the issues facing the city of Reading, we're able to look at some of the root causes that result in high poverty. And one of the biggest ones is education.
Reading School District only has about a 68% graduation rate. So that's a high number. 32% of the kids who start kindergarten in Reading School District will not graduate from the district at the end.
We have a lot of kids who are now following in the adults' footsteps and not having even a high school degree. So that's clearly a challenge and something that needs to be addressed long term.
I grew up here in Reading. I went to Reading High for maybe like 2 years. I didn't graduate from Reading High. I got my GED from Arbor Career Center. I thought I was going to be in college. I was always those type of kids that wanted to go to college, but I wasn't too. I always wanted to be running around too. I had my son. I had Manny at 15, so there crushed my whole dream.
Go read your book. Spanish rice with chicken. Chicken in the oven. Those were the leftovers from last night.
So I got math and I think 2 spellings because I didn't check.
Well, you have
I
to
think-
check. Growing up here, I was always out in the streets pretty much, running around, being a kid. But it was, saw a lot of things happen here. A lot of bad things happen. In some ways, it affected a lot of people where they did the same things. And then to me, I didn't want to do the same things. I didn't want to continue or my kids to see that or me do that. I've had friends with parents on drugs. I've had friends with parents that are in jail for life, or my friends ended up in foster care that I haven't seen in years.
Today I started at Walmart. I'm going to be making $8.20 an hour as a cashier. And it's only seasonal for right now, which the manager said if I did a good job, they usually keep you. But it pretty much all depends. I was customer service at Lowe's for 4 years.
Manny, I thought you said you weren't going to do it, and it's 7:53. So you got 2 minutes.
Actually, the day I left Lowe's, I had to leave because my son was having an asthma attack in school. So I pretty much got fired. They're always being sick. My son takes like 4 meds a day. My other son was just diagnosed with ADHD, so he was always being kicked out of daycare. So hopefully they're good now. I can keep a job now, hopefully. Manuel's 7 and Nasir's 4.
When I worked at Lowe's, I had health insurance for a little bit, but then I told them to discontinue it.